però no només per motius d'asil. La importància d'aquesta directiva és que és la primera directiva de la Unió Europea en general que inclou el concepte d'identitat de gènere. És una llàstima que no la tinguem aquí, però penso que és important destacar aquest fet, doncs perquè penso que és molt transcendent. Quan estem parlant d'orientació sexual, moltes vegades deixem enrere o oblidem el tema de la identitat de gènere o la confonem, i penso que és un tema que val destacar. Gràcies a aquesta eurodiputada britànica, com a mínim la Unió Europea no ha oblidat i ha distingit aquest terme. En principi, bé, jo ja no m'estendré més en aquesta presentació i en aquest sentit el que hauríem de fer és passar el vídeo de la Jean Lambert tal qual estigués aquí. Tampoc se li podran fer preguntes.
Well, I'm sorry I can't be with you for today's conference, but it's a plenary session in Brussels and we're needed to talk about the budget this week. I was asked to say a bit about the LGBT intergroup in the Parliament and then to talk more specifically about some of the changes in the asylum legislation. The LGBT intergroup brings together people from across different political groups in the European Parliament, different countries, to work together in a more informal way on some of the issues that we think are important. We've got 6 co-presidents from different political groups and a membership of about 153 MEPs at the moment who will be more or less active depending as to the issues, but it's a core group that can be counted on for their support. So what does it do as an all-party group? Well, it brings in new research on policy issues which we think are important in the European setting. It brings in amendments to proposed legislation that might be coming through the Parliament or to reports where we want to make a strong point about the needs of LGBTI people. And it also provides, maybe most importantly, a strong link between the grassroots, the local level, the national level, and the European Parliament, so that voices from the grassroots are coming in directly to us with people's lived experience, so that we can develop policy which reflects and answers to that. The group is currently working on 5 priority areas, including free movement, and you might like to watch the progress of the Bauer report here on EU nationals, where we're trying to get mutual recognition of partnerships into that, which would be a very welcome first. It's also working on issues about transgender discrimination and how to combat that. But the full list is on the LGBT Intergroup's website. And we're supported too very well by a secretariat based on ILGA. If we're looking at the asylum legislation, we've recently put through revisions of the major asylum component parts of the European Common Asylum Policy, or not so common as yet. There are still wide variations between member states, as you'll be aware. There we ensured that relevant research was brought into the Parliament, that key amendments were tabled, supported, partly based on the LGBT intergroup, but not only, and also some very successful and intense lobbying at the national level by people involved particularly in ILGA, which is one of the things that has actually brought even the modicum of change that we've got at the moment. So if we look at those 3 directives, there's firstly the Qualifications Directive. What are the criteria for awarding humanitarian protection? And that can be refugee status as under the 1951 Convention, or subsidiary protection, which is based on risk of serious harm rather than on persecution. There's also the Procedures Directive. How should a claim be dealt with within the asylum system? And Receptions Directive. What's your treatment while you're in the asylum process? Now, all of these directives were recast, they were revisions, not a full sort of reworking, which means that some of the big issues we couldn't unfortunately touch. But in the Qualifications Directive, for which I was rapporteur, which means I take it through the Parliament, I'm the person responsible for the negotiations with Council, the big thing there that's new, I think, is around the definition of a particular social group, which is language, of course, from the 1951 UN Convention. In the recital, which is the sort of bit that explains how the directive should work, we talk about that for the purposes of defining a particular social group, issues arising from an applicant's gender, including gender identity and sexual orientation, should be taken into account. And this links to Article 10, which is the key piece of legislation which member states are now supposed to put into their national legislation. And that also is talking about membership of a particular social group. And it will tell you that in the language of the article, depending on the circumstances in the country of origin, a particular social group might include a group based on a common characteristic of sexual orientation. Sexual orientation cannot be understood to include acts considered to be criminal in accordance with national law of member states, but gender-related aspects, including gender identity, shall, and that shall is important, be given due consideration for the purposes of determining membership of a particular social group or identifying a characteristic of this group. So as I say, the shall is important. Member states don't have an option about whether they take this into account or not. It has to be in the primary legislation at national level. And this revised directive is supposed to be in national law by the 21st of December this year, 2013. ILGA has produced an excellent checklist of how the provisions of the directive as a whole should be included in national legislation, and it's really worth looking at that. Now, some member states already have very sound guidelines. They're drawn from the 2008 UNHCR guidelines. And in the European Parliament, we've heard directly from the Belgian authorities. What do they do? How do they deal with claims? How are people there, transgender, treated? And you can also read the 2011 UK Border Agency guidelines on their website. And it has to be said, it's very rare that I say anything positive about the UK asylum system, but those guidelines are really good. And that's interesting, because they're not signing up to the revised directive. These are based on earlier legislation. Ireland's not signed up to the revised one, and of course Denmark never signs up on asylum policy. And their guidelines provide a sober reminder about why it is necessary to have an explicit reference to sexual orientation and gender identity. The Procedures Directive has also got some additions, partly because we got gender identity into the Qualifications Directive, so the Procedures one follows on. And there, it's talking about how certain applicants may be in need of special procedural guarantees, due, amongst other things, to their age, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, and so on. And here, that's important. Also, there are 3 obligations that are now there for member states in the Procedures Directive to identify asylum seekers with special needs. You have no idea how difficult it was to get member states to agree that they needed to actually work out who are people with special needs, to respond to the needs adequately, and to train staff to respond to special needs. That training is important. This is where the guidelines come in. And that is something that we're pushing with the European Asylum Support Office to actually try and make sure that there are similar guidelines across all member states. So we have some advances in the legislation. We're to fight for those, and thank you very much, ILGA and others who worked at member state level to make sure that that happened. We now have the legislation coming into effect. As I say, qualifications should be on the statute books by the end of December. The other directives will take another year or 2. So there's a lot of work to be done at national level to make sure that the provisions are there. For example, in the Receptions Directive, that those people should be kept free from violence due to their sexual orientation or gender identity. So there's a lot of work to be done at the national level as well to make sure that this is successful, it works for everybody. Everybody has their asylum claim fully and properly examined, and those who are in need of protection get it and can feel safe. So it's over to you to help all of us make that a reality. Thank you.